Welcome back to our panel discussion, The Truth About IT Opex and Software-Defined Networking, sponsored by Avaya Government Solutions here on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. Our guests today are Wolf Tomby. He's Chief Technology Officer for Customs and Border Protection. Tom Bayer, the CIO of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Frank Konechny, the CTO in the Office of Information Dominance and CIO at the Air Force. Lorraine Cleary is Director of Product Management and Network Sales Specialist for Avaya Government Solutions. And Eric Olson, Director of Enterprise Systems Engineering in the Office of the CIO at the Justice Department. And when we were talking earlier, there was a lot of discussion about software-defined networking, SDN. And I want to go into that a little bit more. What is it? What are you trying to get from it? And are you getting it from what you've seen so far in the market? Eric, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So a little bit on my perspective on whether it's software-defined networks or any of these emerging technologies. At the Department of Justice, we've had a lot of success with infrastructure as a service in the network space. So we've essentially gotten out of the business of doing the design, build, and run of our wide area network to a large degree, not in totality. So when we start talking about emerging technologies, we look to understand how the service providers are going to implement this. When they can implement it and demonstrate a shift to the better in the value proposition, better service, better price, what have you, then I think we're ready to move. So our philosophy has been to work with those best-in-class service providers to benchmark ourselves against with other, I'll say, similarly situated organizations in terms of scope and complexity, and get out of the business, if you will, of the R&D on some of these really emerging technologies. Because when it's ready for prime time and it can demonstrate value, then we're ready to go. And that's sort of been our philosophy here on.
So you don't really want to be a pioneer in some of these new technologies?
Absolutely not. I want to be a fast follower, and I want to be very good at buying the service when it's ready to go, but we don't want to be in the business of figuring out how it all works and stitches together on our own.
All right, so Wolf, that means you'll try SDN and then tell Eric how it works?
Potentially. So, as Eric mentioned, SDN is still definitely an emerging technology. It's evolving daily. And while some people will consider that a risk, and to some extent I agree with that, I also consider it a great opportunity. This is an opportunity for the government and industry to come together, work with the standards bodies to actually create open standards for how SDNs should provide their dynamic network provisioning services, and work with the vendors to ensure that they're going to be adopting and promoting those standards. That gives us great economies of scale and the ability to use different vendors' versions of SDN and make sure that they can work together. So there's great advantages, I think, for the government and industry in terms of those capabilities and helping them evolve into what we need.
So, Lorraine, tell us about standards, the importance of them to networking and to the vendor community.
Yeah, and this is the problem with software-defined networking right now, is the fact that, data networking in general is doing a 180. So what you have in your current network, it will not be there in a few years because you can't run these archaic technologies. And what software-defined networking is trying to do is they're trying to take the brains of the network and automate the provisioning, because there's a lot of problems in the current network, and it's preventing these mission-critical apps and slow time to service for new applications.
So when you say provisioning the capacity, I mean, what does that mean? How does that work?
So say the HR department came to your IT shop and they wanted to put up a new application. So you've already virtualized the server in the data center. So great. Now you can optimize the resources in your data center and you can just add it to an existing server. But say now you had to go to the IT shop, and Wolf alluded to this a little bit earlier. You have to say, okay, now I want this new VLAN configured in my network. You may have 50 switches in the network, and that means that the IT shop may have to go to 25 of them, manually configure this VLAN on these boxes to actually get that connectivity from point A to point B, again, that device to that application. It's that bottleneck within the network that the IT shop, so now it'll go through a change control process. They'll have to redesign the network a little bit. It'll be a maintenance window on a Sunday morning from 2 to 6 where they're under pressure to get this in. It's very error prone. A lot of times it doesn't support quality of service, which I know we'll get into a little bit later. What SDN's trying to do is they're trying to say, okay, if I have to do that, let me have a computer in the data center or whatever, and you're typing in a template. I want point A to point B. I want this quality of service and all the metrics that typically are manually configured in the network. They're going to hit a button, it's going to go to this controller, and it's going to magically configure all this in the network. Well, unfortunately, though, that controller now has to talk to all these boxes in the network with application programming interfaces.
And is it also true, too, that if you have a virtual or a full physical application, you have more than one instance of it because you have more users than one instance can support, typically, right? So
That's right.
Does that add to the complexity of this whole?
It definitely adds to complexity. And this with the standards, so to your question, there's a lot of standards like around OpenFlow right now. But what's happening is the standards are evolving so quickly that the vendors can't keep up with the version that they're on. So one vendor may be on version 1.1 of, say, OpenFlow. Another vendor's on 1.4. Completely different functionality. And when they implement these use cases for SDN, they're usually specific to services. So they may be virtualizing or optimizing a firewall application or a load balancing application, and not the whole network. And that's really the problem right now is they're coming out in very specific use cases, and it's hard to get interoperability and standardization that way.
Tom, what have you seen from the SEC in that regard? Because I know SEC is a big standards pusher. I mean, you're practically the main driving force behind XBRL, for example.
Yes.
What about in the networking area?
So we are big believers in standards and interoperability and also flexibility of those networks. We want to achieve cost savings. We want to have a higher quality of service both within the network as well as for our users. And we want to be able to make changes accurately and efficiently. And so we really hold out the promise of realizing the gains from a software-defined network, and we very much would like to pursue it. Unfortunately, right now, we believe, as the other members of the panel, it's not there yet, and so we would urge people to accept those standards and drive to a solution that would provide us and allow us to realize the gains.
And Frank, have you looked at those things in the Air Force, that type of computer that could do that, and found that it didn't work, or what's your view
We started
here?
looking at it basically for the data center level. Network is much more complex than that. And, we have virtual routing and forwarding segments. We have, which separate communities of interest from each other. We have all sorts of issues that would be nice if it was dynamically provisioned. However, there's a concern of security at this also, because if it's software-based, there's always a way of getting in there and causing malware to occur. And that'll be the primary concern that we would have, again, is that, there's ways of getting into the hardware already that we have to very carefully watch. So this is now software-based again, and it's virtualized, so you have to be careful from the security viewpoint of how this is all going to work together, and if there's a way of disrupting the network without you knowing about it, it'll be very, very difficult to.
So you're worried if someone could get into that controller that is doing the software-defined networking, then
Yes, the
they can
controlling
define
piece.
it any way they want,
That's right.
or turn it off altogether.
Yes, that would be the
Block all
worst.
channels. That would be
Yes.
the worst. And you were also talking about the communities of interest, and we've been talking about the different applications, and which gets us into the idea that a network really does many things. And the problem is it can't always do them all at once. So we get into this idea of quality of service. And we'll continue with you, Frank, for a moment. Does quality of service always mean, well, that video goes first and that's it? Or is it a little more subtle than that?
It's more subtle than that. It's a way of tuning down some of the application's transaction flows as well. For instance, since we have a base community, we have people living on the base, and they act like every other city that's out there, going into social media and everything else as well. And the question becomes, what point do you turn down the social media when there's base operations going on? And so there has to be a selective way of looking at quality of service, like with the RPA missions as well. When we look at an RPA mission, that network components have to be very well organized, structured, controlled. And so that quality of service is right up there at the top.
And so is that true also, Eric, of the Justice Department? I mean, it's sometimes you may want video priority. Say, the Attorney General has a video message, but also a time of, say, national emergency when, the Attorney General's going to have to wait a minute. We've got other reasons to use the network. So how do you look at that quality of service issue with the network
I think
you've
when we're
got?
talking about something like quality of service, we're really talking about more broadly is how do we assure the network is performing given the diverse set of applications that we need to run? How do we allocate network resources when they're constrained? And we look at quality of service as just one of many tools that are sort of available to us to do that. We use quality of service, class of service extensively in our wide area networks today, in particular to run applications that require real-time, kind of dynamics, video teleconferencing, voice over IP, things like that. But in some cases, quality service is not going to do it. So we look at other things like caching, content delivery networks, WAN optimization. Sometimes you do just need to throw more bandwidth at it, and sometimes that can be the most effective way to deal with it. So we look at a lot of different things.
All right. And Wolf, what about QoS, I should say, quality of service?
Yeah. So for CBP, we actually like to use the term quality of experience instead of quality of service, because we do look at it as the full end-to-end chain of IT services that have to run over the network. And what we're looking at is measures that tell us how well we're doing in terms of meeting officer and agent productivity and efficiency, and especially in terms of officer safety. How are we meeting those requirements from a mission perspective?
All right, so Lorraine, we've talked a lot about SDN and its potential, but if there's only a potential, what do you do in the meantime?
That's the huge question, right? Because now every decision that you're making on your network, you are choosing a path going down a road. And you're either continuing to stay on that path that you're currently on, which may not be the most optimized. And when you look at the network, you can't look at what you currently have in there as the solution, because it's going to change completely. So talking about the Opex, you may even increase your CapEx costs as you go down this SDN vision. If you implement too soon, the vendor's not ready with the appropriate standard, the standard switch, now you have to do another upgrade on your network. So it's really critical during this transitioning time that you do proof of concepts. Make the vendors bring in their equipment. Make them show you what they've got. Make a list of your services that you need to provide. Make a spreadsheet. Here's my voice, here's my load balancing, my firewall, all the services that you provide on that network. What are the characteristics on the network that you need? What's the latency, the jitter, the quality of service requirements? And then take that and push that against the standards and do a comparison. Because some standards will come out and they're specific for maybe one or two of those services. But when you start to run it on the entire network with all your services, it falls short on 6 of 10. So doing proof of concepts, making sure that you are picking the standard that is going to ultimately get you all the way down the road, not just partially.
Frank, what is your strategy right now for short-term optimization of your WAN while we wait for this glorious future down the line of software-defined networking?
We've been working on WAN optimization, obviously, and how to do that. It's kind of complex because we have an MPLS network already established. And so that's the first step. We've been virtualizing a lot of the network capabilities already at each of the bases, getting ready for it. But it's a question of, again, applying the controller level software network, software-defined network capability onto all of that we still have to get forward with. I mean, we've looked at it. We've looked at some of the capabilities from the vendors, and we're still experimenting with them.
And what are your patterns in terms of traffic? I mean, is it safe to assume that it's growing?
It's growing. It's growing all the time. A lot of it, obviously, is internet traffic coming in. The email traffic is horrendous. I mean, it's billions of messages. Mm-hmm. And so you have to be able to filter all that as well. So the capacity of the network coming in and going out is stressed already. Now, as we get inside the network itself, inside the WAN, you're going to get more experiences of applications running that have to run, which is quality of service, which we do monitor a lot of. But again, the network is essential to everything that we do.
All right, Eric, you mentioned earlier that a lot of your network design, engineering, and services are outsourced. So short of the latest technology, what are you hoping your carriers and vendors will do, or what are you telling them you want short term for getting better performance?
Right. So I don't like the word outsourced because that connotates a certain model. I like the infrastructure as service. It's a managed service agreement. Mm-hmm. Where we essentially contract with a best-in-class service provider to provide our wide area network. We get unitized prices. We get a service level that they need to meet, and we can demonstrate the value to the department. So with this as sort of the basis, what we're looking at is to extend the concept of infrastructure as a service into the other areas of our networking space, into the local area networks, into data center networks, even into some of the wireless areas, because we believe through the combined spend, the economies of scale, strategic sourcing, the standardization that occurs, and I think if we're going to have any chance of doing things with software-defined networks, you've got to get kind of a overall umbrella view of all of the network elements sort of under a single control space. And I think we have the best chance of doing that by approaching it from an infrastructure as a service perspective.
So do your providers give you that? I guess sometimes they call it a single pane of glass to be able to see what's going on across the Justice Department?
Yes, but I want to be clear that we look to the provider to run the network. And so we get into challenges when we start looking over their shoulder and
Right.
second guessing them. We manage to the service level, and we measure the performance of the network, and we deal with the deviations from there. But the purpose of the single pane of glass is not to look over
You
their
don't
shoulder
want to sit on it,
and
right.
second guess the way they're building it. That's why we engage with them. They're smarter than us and more experienced than us in stitching all these emerging technologies together.
All right, we're going to take a break on that note. Our guests today are Eric Olson. He's Director of Enterprise Systems Engineering in the Office of the CIO at the Justice Department. Wolf Tomby is Chief Technology Officer of Customs and Border Protection. Tom Bayer is the CIO of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Frank Konechny is the CTO in the Office of Information Dominance and CIO at the Air Force. And Lorraine Cleary, Director of Product Management and Network Sales Specialist for Avaya Government Solutions. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin, and this is The Truth About IT Opex and Software-Defined Networking, sponsored by Avaya Government Solutions, here on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM.